Imagine a lighthouse. Its only purpose is to guide souls away from the jagged rocks and into the safety of the harbor. But on December 15, 1900, the light at Eilean Mor didn't just flicker, it died. For the sailors aboard the steamer Archtor, that darkness wasn't just a technical failure. It felt like a cold hand tightening around their throats. They didn't know it yet, but they were the first witnesses to a mystery that would defy logic for over a century. A mystery where 3 grown men didn't just die, they evaporated. The Flannan Isles, a cluster of 7 jagged rocks off the coast of Scotland, are often called the Seven Hunters. Local folklore warns that these islands belong to something else, something ancient. For centuries, shepherds refused to stay on the islands after dark, but the British government needed a lighthouse there. They built a towering stone sentinel, manned by 3 seasoned veterans, James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. These weren't men who scared easily. They were hardened by the sea, trained to survive the most brutal isolation. Because of a massive storm, the relief ship, the Hesperus, couldn't reach the island until December 26th. Captain James Harvey expected a warm welcome, perhaps a signal flare or a flag. Instead, he found a silence so thick it felt physical. The air was dead. No one was at the landing stage to receive the supplies. Harvey blew the ship's whistle, a piercing blast that echoed off the cliffs, but the only response was the crying of seagulls. Joseph Moore, the relief keeper, volunteered to go ashore alone. As he climbed the steep, winding stone steps toward the lighthouse, he felt a sense of overwhelming dread. He reached the heavy oak door. It was closed. He pushed it open and called out. No answer. The silence inside was even louder than the wind outside. When Moore entered the kitchen, the sight froze his blood. On the table sat a meal of salted fish and potatoes, untouched but served. A chair lay toppled on the floor, as if someone had stood up in a violent hurry. The clock on the wall had stopped. But here is the detail that keeps investigators awake at night. The main door was locked from the inside. If the keepers had gone out to fix something, why would they lock the door behind them from the inside? And why, in the freezing December cold of the North Atlantic, were 2 of their heavy waterproof oilskins still hanging on the rack? Only one was missing. 2 men had seemingly walked out into a lethal storm in their shirt sleeves. Moore searched every corner. The beds were unmade, the lamps were cleaned and refilled, but the men were gone. It was as if a giant hand had reached through the stone walls and plucked them into the void. After Joseph Moore discovered the empty kitchen and the half-eaten meal, the air inside the Eilean Mor lighthouse felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. But the most chilling evidence wasn't what was missing, it was what was left behind. On the desk sat the official logbook. In the world of lighthouse keepers, the logbook is a sacred record. It is the heartbeat of the station. What was written in those final pages would eventually baffle experts and haunt the dreams of everyone who read them. The entries began on December 12th. Thomas Marshall, the primary keeper for the day, wrote, "Severe gale, the likes of which I have never seen in 20 years. He noted that James Duckett, a man known for his iron-willed stoicism, was unusually quiet. But the next line sent shivers down Joseph Moore's spine. Donald MacArthur is crying. Think about that for a moment. Donald MacArthur was a veteran sailor, a man who had survived countless storms and was known as a tough, brawling character in his youth. Why was a man like that crying because of a storm? And it gets darker. The entry for December 13th read, "The storm continues. All 3 of us are praying." Here is where the story shifts from a tragedy to something impossible. According to the logbook, a storm of biblical proportions was battering the Flannan Isles for 3 straight days. However, when investigators checked the official maritime weather records from that exact time, they found something shocking. On December 12th, 13th, and 14th, the weather in the region was calm. There were no gales, no storms. The seas were reported as steady. If the world outside was calm, what kind of storm were these 3 men seeing? Were they trapped in a localized weather anomaly, or were they experiencing a shared psychological breakdown? Or perhaps was something else screaming outside their window, something they perceived as a storm, but was actually a force far more ancient and terrifying. The last entry was dated December 15th. It was short, cold, and final. It simply read, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all." Those were the last words ever written by the keepers of Eilean Mor. The storm had ended, yet the men were gone. If the sea was calm, how could 3 experienced sailors be swept away? Why would they leave the safety of a bolted stone tower to go toward a calm sea? As Joseph Moore and the investigators moved to the West Landing, the area where the men would have gone to secure equipment, they found a scene of total devastation. Iron railings were twisted like dry straw. A supply box 110 feet above sea level had been smashed to pieces. A rock weighing over a ton had been moved. At first, this looked like the work of a massive wave, but it didn't explain the logbook. If a rogue wave hit them on the 15th when the sea was calm, why were they crying and praying on the 12th? And why did they leave the lighthouse door locked behind them? You don't lock a door if you're running for your life from a wave. You lock a door when you're trying to keep something out. The deeper they looked, the more they realized. The men weren't just missing, they were taken, and whatever took them had made them lose their minds long before they reached the water's edge. Long before the lighthouse was built, the Flannan Isles were known as the Seven Hunters. For the locals on the Isle of Lewis, these weren't just rocks, they were sacred, forbidden ground. It was said that the islands were home to the small folk, or the phantom birds, entities that did not take kindly to intruders. In fact, shepherds would bring their sheep to the islands for grazing during the day, but they would never, under any circumstances, spend the night there. They believed that once the sun dipped below the horizon, the island no longer belonged to the world of the living. There were ancient protocols for anyone brave enough to step onto Eilean Mor. When sailors landed, they were required to perform a specific ritual. They had to strip off their upper garments, turn their caps inside out, and walk around the island sunwise while whispering ancient prayers. This wasn't superstition to them, it was survival. They believed the island was sentient, a living organism that listened to every word. When the British government decided to build a lighthouse there, the locals whispered that it was a mistake. You cannot pin down a restless spirit with stone and mortar. During the construction of the lighthouse in 1899, workers reported a heavy, oppressive feeling. Some claimed to hear voices in the wind that sounded like crying, the same crying that would later appear in Thomas Marshall's logbook. Is it possible that the three keepers, isolated for weeks in total solitude, became targets for the island's ancient residents? Think about the name, the Seven Hunters. If the islands are the hunters, who are the prey? Some theorists believe that the lighthouse itself acted as a lightning rod for supernatural activity. By shining a massive, artificial light into a place of ancient darkness, the keepers had effectively declared war on the shadows. There is a chilling local legend about giant birds, or shape-shifting entities that live in the caves beneath Eilean Mor. One theory suggests that the keepers didn't drown. Instead, they were taken by something that came from the sky or the cliffs. This would explain why 2 oilskins were left behind. If you are snatched suddenly by something that doesn't belong to this dimension, you don't have time to grab your coat. It would also explain the crying and praying. Perhaps they weren't seeing a storm of wind and rain, but a storm of entities surrounding the glass gallery of the lighthouse. Among the 3 keepers, Donald MacArthur was the most volatile. He was the one the logbook described as crying and being broken by the storm. In Scottish folklore, there is a concept called second sight, the ability to see omens of death. Was MacArthur seeing the hunters closing in while the other 2 were still trying to find a logical explanation? One of the most haunting details reported by later keepers was the sound of a name being called from the cliffs, Donald. For decades after the disappearance, relief keepers claimed that when the wind hit a certain frequency, it sounded exactly like a human voice screaming for help from the West Landing. But when they looked, there was only the crashing of the waves against the cold, indifferent stone. The island had claimed its inhabitants, and now it was keeping their echoes. After the folklore and the ghost stories, investigators tried to ground the Eilean Mor mystery in reality. They needed a physical answer for why 3 men vanished from a locked lighthouse. The most logical explanation provided by the official report was a rogue wave. These are spontaneous, massive walls of water that can reach 100 feet in height, appearing out of nowhere even in relatively calm seas. The theory suggests that a massive wave struck the West Landing, and as the men were trying to secure a supply crane, it swept them all into the abyss at once. But science often struggles with the details. If a wave swept them away, why were the lighthouse lamps cleaned, trimmed, and ready for the night? Why was the kitchen door locked from the inside? If you are outside being hit by a wave, you don't lock the door behind you. And then there is the oilskin mystery. In the brutal, freezing spray of a North Atlantic December, no experienced keeper would step outside without his waterproof gear. Yet, 2 of the 3 heavy coats remained on their hooks. It's as if 2 men ran out in their shirt sleeves to help the 3rd, ignoring the laws of survival in a moment of pure, blinding panic. Or perhaps they weren't running to something, they were running from something inside the tower. There is a terrifying scientific phenomenon called infrasound, sound frequencies below 20 Hz, which are silent to the human ear but devastating to the human brain. Certain rock formations and narrow sea caves, like those on Eilean Mor, can vibrate in high winds, creating these low-frequency waves. Studies show that 19 Hz vibrations can cause the human eye to resonate, creating gray ghosts in the periphery of your vision. It causes intense feelings of dread, nausea, and the sensation of being watched by a predatory presence. Did the seven hunters create a natural frequency that drove these men into a shared state of madness? Were the crying and praying entries the result of a brain being melted by sound? Then, there are the fringe theories that suggest Eilean Mor is a chronal rift, a place where time doesn't flow in a straight line. This would explain the logbook paradox. How could the keepers experience a 3-day hurricane when the rest of the world saw a clear sky? Some theorists suggest the lighthouse was caught in a localized time dilation. To the men inside, the world was ending in a storm of fire and wind. To the ships passing by, the island was just a silent rock. When the two times synced back up, the men were gone, left behind in a fold of history that we can no longer reach. The mystery didn't stop in 1900. In 1971, the lighthouse was finally automated, but not before another keeper reported something unsettling. He claimed that while looking out at the West Landing through binoculars, he saw 3 men standing by the crane, wearing 1900s-style uniforms. They weren't moving, they were just looking back at the lighthouse. When he looked away for a split second and looked back, the landing was empty. The island doesn't just take people, it seems to keep them in a loop, replaying their final, terrified moments over and over again in the salt and the spray. When the official inquiry by Robert Muirhead concluded, the verdict was simple. The men were swept away by an unexpected sea. It was a clean answer for a messy tragedy. The government wanted to reassure other lighthouse keepers that they were safe, that the ocean was the only enemy. But those who stood in that kitchen, who saw the locked door and the toppled chair, knew better. They knew that a wave doesn't explain the crying in the logs. A wave doesn't explain the missing oilskins. And a wave certainly doesn't explain the localized storm that no one else on Earth could see. Today, the Eilean Mor Lighthouse is fully automated. No human has lived on that rock since 1971. The British government decided that the isolation was too much for the human psyche. But even without residents, the stories persist. Modern maintenance crews who visit the island for routine checks often report a strange hum in the air, a vibration that makes their skin crawl and their ears ring. Some say it's just the wind in the sea caves. Others believe the 19 Hz ghost frequency is still active, vibrating the very atoms of the island, waiting for a new mind to shatter. What really happened to James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur? Did they stumble into a rift in time? Were they victims of a secret psychological experiment by nature itself? Or did they simply see something so horrifying coming up from the cliffs that they chose the cold embrace of the Atlantic over staying another minute inside that stone tower? The mystery of Eilean Mor isn't just about 3 missing men. It's a reminder that there are still places on this map where the laws of man and the laws of science simply do not apply. Places where the darkness doesn't just surround you, it speaks to you. If you ever find yourself on the coast of Scotland, looking out toward the Flannan Isles, you might see a faint light blinking on the horizon. It's a warning that some doors, once locked from the inside, should never be opened. But this is only the surface of the mystery. The deeper you go, the darker it gets. Because remember, on Eilean Mor, the light is on, but there hasn't been anyone home for over 100 years. Or has there?